Thank you, Bob. Today's webinar is on life cycle assessment, and I've had the pleasure to get to know Jesse Daystar and learn more about his research work here at NC State University. Just a little background on Jesse. He's a pioneer in the field of life cycle assessment of forest biomaterials, and he is a PhD candidate at NC State, where his research is focused on the environmental impacts of second-generation biofuels and biomaterials production from cutting-edge conversion technologies. Jesse is also the president of Triangle Life Cycle Assessment and has undergraduate degrees in pulp and paper engineering and also chemical engineering. His previous work experience includes working with the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, where he collaborated in the development of the widely used and publicly available Forest Industry Carbon Assessment Tool and the Footprint Estimator for Forest Products. Jesse has also led the implementation of cellulosic biofuel technologies as Director of Biofuels at PESCO Beam Environmental Solutions. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Jesse Daystar, and you can hear about all his wonderful research work.
Thanks, Celine, for the great introduction. I'd like to thank you and everybody else who's helped put this on today, as well as my co-authors, Carter Reeb, Ronald Gonzalez, Richard Renditti, and Steve Kelly. And as we mentioned, that today's webinar is going to be on examining biofuels and how they impact the environment in the southern U.S. So, as an outline of where we're going today, we're going to start out by introducing biofuels in general and also LCA, then dive into two somewhat individual but related LCA studies that we did on one, feedstock production for biofuels, and taking that data and using it in a larger study and examining how biofuels ethanol impacts the environment, and kind of wrap it up in some conclusions. So getting right into it, there's a few forces or things in our society which are driving us to examine biofuels as an energy source. First is energy security. It would be better to create our energy perhaps in the United States and not buy it from some other country. Additionally, it's climate change. There's been a lot of support and evidence from the scientific community that global warming is actually happening, and fossil fuels may be contributing to that. And also rural development, keeping jobs in the United States and stimulating the rural economy. And these are three of the major factors which are driving research in this area. There's actually been some legislation that mandates fuel production in the United States, that being the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS and RFS2. There are several approved feedstocks here for cellulosic biomass ethanol, and today we're going to look at just a couple of them, one being residues or slash, and also switchgrass, but there's a wide list of cellulosic materials here that can be used for ethanol production. And under the Renewable Fuel Standard, the fuel has to be qualified into several different categories. We're going to be examining cellulosic biofuel on the bottom there, and they're required to have a 60% reduction in greenhouse gases as compared to gasoline, and also be made from one of those previously listed cellulosic materials as a feedstock. So they want to ensure that the use of these fuels will actually yield some environmental benefit. If you don't know a whole lot about biofuels, there's a few concepts that are very important to the overall foundation and why they may actually benefit the environment. One of the major ones is this carbon cycle. On the left here you have biomass growth to trees or perhaps switchgrass. You would then harvest it using different machines. It takes some diesel, has some emissions. If it's a switchgrass or sweet sorghum or something that's an annual or not a full year growing crop, you would store it for a while, and that also has emissions. Require transportation, and then once you get the biomass at the facility, converting it to a fuel also has emissions and takes energy. Eventually you combust it, releasing CO2 that could potentially be captured back in that biomass. So the takeaway here is there's somewhat of a loop here. It's not 100% recycled. Nonetheless, though, a lot of it is. Fortunate for us, life cycle assessment is a tool which gives us the ability to calculate how much of that carbon is recycled perhaps, or how much is released during this production process. So it's typically defined as a system to evaluate the environmental impacts of a product, service, or good. And there's several different aspects to an LCA. First is goal and scope definition, inventory analysis, impact assessment, and interpretation. In a bit more detail, in developing a goal, you might set out for a study, I would like to understand how these biofuels impact the environment or compare to gasoline, as an example. A scope perhaps would be a boundary system. Is it going to be from the very beginning of raw materials to the end use and perhaps landfill? Or is it just going to be around the production process? So where and what are you going to include in your system, in your study? Also a functional unit. What are you comparing? Are you comparing a unit of energy of fuel, such as a megajoule of fuel, to between just several fuel types, or are you comparing something else? After you've defined what you're actually looking at in a great amount of detail, you have to determine a life cycle inventory, or all the inputs and outputs to your system. That will be raw materials, different energies, and emissions coming out of the system due to production and fuel use, etc. These emissions don't actually tell you a whole lot about how the product or service actually impacts the environment. Different emissions have different impacts. So performing a life cycle impact assessment is important to translate these raw emissions into some sort of indicator for the environmental impact of a product, service, or good. Once you've done that, interpreting results is important, and a lot of times with that you have a sensitivity analysis or uncertainty analysis to determine which factors within the system are most important, or which ones have the most uncertainty, and it really assists in understanding and drawing conclusions from your work. And a lot of times, once you've determined something, figured out what area is most important, you might need to go back and redo part of the study, make it more robust, or define things in further detail. So it's an iterative process to all this. And to kind of illustrate how life cycle methodology can really impact the results, this is a table that describes or lists several life cycle assessments or greenhouse gas studies around biofuels. As you can see on the left here with switchgrass, there was a negative 114% reduction for greenhouse gas displacement as compared to gasoline, whereas on the right, down the bottom, the corn is 93% worse than gasoline. So there's a wide range. And that's partially due to the different feedstocks, but also assumptions surrounding the study, such as was land use change considered? Was it direct land use change, indirect land use change? What was actually examined? And we'll get more into which assumptions are perhaps important and actually do some analysis surrounding that. But really, the defining the goal and scope is important, and it can really impact the later overall results. One area that is really important for biomass production, or for biofuels production, is biomass. It's not only does it take up the carbon from the environment, and also it takes a lot of energy to create sometimes, it also drives the financials. It can be as much as 35% of the overall cost of the production of biofuels. So this presentation is primarily on life cycle assessment in biofuels, but this part of the study we examined financial analysis along with that, and it gives you a bit more information. So we're going to discuss that in just a moment. So moving into the case study surrounding the feedstock production for biofuels, we had a goal of identifying feedstock production scenarios with the lowest environmental impact and greenhouse gas emissions. We also coupled that with determining feedstocks with the lowest delivered cost. And we reported both of those parameters, impacts and costs, on 3 functional units. One would be per dry ton basis of biomass, or per mass of the material coming in without the water. And that's pretty much useful. That's a common metric for understanding biomass. But if a facility or a person was interested in using this biomass or creating ethanol using fermentation, a biochemical route, the ethanol is really derived from fermenting carbohydrates. So understanding the impact or cost for kind of the actual starting material of carbohydrates may be more useful. In the situation of MMBTU, if you're trying to burn the material to create energy, you might not want ash or other parts of the material of the plant that don't contribute to heat. So if you report it on a million BTU basis, it's slightly more descriptive and useful to a potential audience. And this study was performed on a cradle-to-gate basis, so that it would be easily used for other studies, and we can couple it with later studies with different conversion technologies. And to further describe the cradle-to-gate, we have two process flow diagrams here. On the left, we have biomass production. Within that sub-box, we have plantation establishment and maintenance, and that takes fertilizers, diesel, herbicides, some things to get the plants going, and machinery. And it also takes in CO2, as we mentioned earlier. After that, harvesting also requires diesel as well as transportation. I don't have listed here, but unmanaged hardwood and forest residues, they don't have the biomass production segment. There's no diesel or anything like that attributed to it. However, the harvesting is actually collection, and we also have to transport those types of biomass as well. Moving on to the agriculture type biomass, we have switchgrass and sweet sorghum. And the left-hand side is relatively similar. There's a little bit more pesticides and herbicides, and there's more diesel perhaps in overall usage. But the storage, that's a new block that wasn't on the other flow diagram. Since these materials cannot be harvested year-round, they're grown in the summer and harvested in the summer, approximately 70% of the total biomass needed to supply a facility has to be stored somewhere. And when it's stored, it actually degrades and creates CO2 emissions as well as potentially other emissions. So that's going to be something significant that these two feedstock types experience that the forest-based ones do not. So as I said earlier, we did not only a LCA approach to this, but we also examined financial analysis. And here's just some inputs to the analysis. We had such things as growth rates, cost to establish a forest, and also the type of IRR and kind of revenues that the farmer, harvester, people who store it, and also transportation, what kind of revenue those different parties would expect to get. And based upon all that, we calculated a delivered cost. And that's the cost delivered to potentially a biomass user, for instance, a biofuels facility delivered to their gate. And here we have the different input parameters for something's going on, excuse me. Okay, the screen is back, my apologies. We have a table here that describes the different inputs, and on the top we have productivity. That was very important to the overall study. And on the left-hand side with loblolly palm, we have around 7, and the forest residue, eucalyptus is about 7 again, 7.5. Unmanaged hardwoods is lower at 1, switchgrass was 8, and the last two numbers in this figure or table are actually incorrect. I converted them to dry tons per acre, and I had a typo, so they would be sweet sorghum 6.4 and forest residues about 0.4 acres per dry tons per acre per year. So those parameters drive how much carbon you take in per acre, as well as how much material you get for how much fertilizer you put in. Another interesting point would be the rotation length. Typically, loblolly pines for most applications are grown for longer periods of time, but for just creating a lot of biomass that's going to be taken apart and potentially made into biofuels, 12 years has been shown to be sometimes more will yield higher biomass quantities. And eucalyptus is 4 years, a relatively short period. Unmanaged hardwood would probably not be grown for biofuels. However, it's a nice reference to understand how everything else compares with that, and it was grown for 50 years. And also moisture content's interesting in this situation too. The wood was around 45% and switchgrass was 16%, and sweet sorghum was much higher at 74%, which will have implications to which technology you would use to convert this into fuel. And there's some other assumptions on here about cost and the different number of trees we plant per acre. Here's a table with lots of numbers that I don't expect you to really dig into and understand. I'd like to point out just a few things about this. First, on the left-hand side, we accounted for the different inputs to the system for chemical use, transportation, and fuel use. And we indicated the diesel, all the different chemicals within all those different categories, as well as on the top we have, for each individual type of material, we have a low, medium, and high. and that indicates we did a sensitivity surrounding the biomass productivity, or the medium scenario would be the productivity listed, for instance, 8 tons per acre per year. And we also scale that up to by 25% to around 10 and down to about 6 to indicate or to reflect what might happen in reality when there's not enough rain or the soil quality is lower or higher in different situations. So keeping all the different assumptions the same except for the productivity, we varied that. And that helps us model or give a range of what you may actually experience in reality.
Jesse, I have one question for you before we move forward. On your system boundaries, we had a question. The forest-based, did you include carbon dioxide emissions from harvesting?
Yes, we did. We included that, and that would be from the from the diesel used in machinery. We did include that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. And you can actually see that here. Here is a figure that describes the greenhouse gas emissions per ton of biomass, and that's on the left axis, left y-axis. And on the left side, we have biomass growth. You can see that the forest-based materials have a relatively similar carbon uptake during growth. The agriculture materials, switchgrass and sweet sorghum, have a little bit lower, they capture a little bit less carbon. That's partially due to the carbon content of the material. Establishment and maintenance emissions due to switchgrass, for switchgrass and sweet sorghum, is actually a little higher than the forest-based materials. And also storage is going to be a emission for those as well. Transportation seems to be not that big of a deal. It has a lower impact than most impact categories for these. And the overall net, when you compare the forest-based materials to the agriculture, the forest materials take up somewhat more carbon than the agricultures. And that's, again, due to the carbon content of the material as well as the different establishment maintenance practices and different logistical aspects of those materials. As I said earlier, we not only looked at the greenhouse gas emissions and the LCA specs, we looked at delivered costs. So for delivered costs for dry ton of biomass, the forest-based materials are relatively similar. Unmanaged hardwood's a bit higher, and switchgrass actually was higher in sweet sorghum. So they ranged anywhere from $50 to $80 per ton. And there's a range there for both the greenhouse gas emissions and the cost. When examining the cost per ton of carbohydrate, which would be useful to a person wanting to do a biochemical conversion, the forest-based materials have a similar trend to the previous graph, but the one thing that's mainly different about this is the sweet sorghum. It has a high level of carbohydrates, both soluble and insoluble, so its cost per ton of carbohydrates is going to be a little bit lower than what it would be on a per ton basis, and it looks competitive with all the rest. Another advantage of sweet sorghum is, as I mentioned earlier, it's got soluble sugar, so a lot of these sugars can be taken out very easily before you go and extract the sugars locked up in cellulose. And if a facility was interested in burning the material, the cost per million BTU would be more interesting. So it's around $4 per ton, give or take, and they're relatively similar across the board. Forest residues is a little bit lower due to the heating value of that and also just the cost on a per ton basis. When examining the biomass on a cost per million BTUs and greenhouse gas emissions and comparing it to what we typically use for energy, which is perhaps coal and natural gas as two materials, it's interesting to see how they stack up. The biomass types are on the left side of the y-axis, indicating that they take up carbon during growth, and there are some emissions of carbon for coal and natural gas, and they're on the right side. The cost is on the y-axis, and you'll notice that coal is definitely lower at around maybe $1.80 per million BTUs, and natural gas is about 4. There's some variability in natural gas. I checked just yesterday, and it was around 370 or somewhere in mid-3s, and we have reported around 4, but there's variability there. And the biomass types, they're around $4, and that's per million BTUs. I'd like to mention, though, that the efficiency of conversion of this fuel to energy is not the same for natural gas and biomass. There's some moisture and other aspects of biomass that make it more difficult to convert and harvest or harness the energy from that. So it's neat to compare it, and it's interesting. However, it would be a little bit different if you were to simulate a full biomass to energy production system, and it would most likely be cheaper with natural gas. And as well, I'd like to mention that natural gas prices will likely fall into the future with the new natural gas collection methods in the United States. And one of the first tables, I showed you all the different studies and the variability amongst those. One of the big things that drives the drastically different greenhouse gas reductions is land use change. There's two types of land use change, direct and indirect. Today we're just going to discuss direct land use change. And that is more or less defined as changing, for instance, a field into a forest, actually planting material somewhere within your study and within your control. Indirect land use change would be something that's outside your control that is a result of something you do, or a facility or something like that. So when you change for instance, a grassy field into a forest, there's going to be materials that accumulate on the ground, such as twigs, sticks, roots, that contain carbon, and then the carbon in that area is actually going to increase. So that would be a negative emission or a capture of carbon within the plant material on that land. And we use the International Panel for Climate Change data and FICAT model, and that examines soil type, land type, moisture, and also where this land use change was actually occurring. There's a lot going on in this figure here, but on the left we have the kilograms of CO2 equivalents per hectare over 100 years. And we have the different starting land uses on the top here. We have cropland on the left, grassland, natural forest, and coniferous natural forest. So to help guide you through this, if we were to convert from cropland to that blue bar, which is pine, it would actually take up a significant amount of carbon. And then zooming over to the right side of this figure, if we have a coniferous natural forest that we convert to sweet sorghum, we'd have a fairly large emission or release of carbon due to that transition from a really nice forest that has lots of big roots and debris on the ground to a sweet sorghum field which has less of that. So there'd be some emission to the environment of greenhouse gases. On the very far right side, we have the net greenhouse gases per hectare over 100 years with no land use change. So you can see, as comparison, it's a significant amount, maybe 10–15% of the overall emission or carbon uptake. So I've given you a brief overview, and we discussed the biomass production, LCA, and financial analysis. That's only part of the story, and really the biofuels, understanding how the biofuels compare to gasoline is somewhat more interesting. So we've taken from the left side the feedstock model. We have that little Excel figure there, and then now we're going to combine that with the conversion process, which can be modeled in Aspen Plus, and I'll discuss that in a moment. And we use data from GREET to understand the emissions due to tailpipe combustions or tailpipe emissions, and we combine that in some MPROGs and some other data to do a full cradle-to-grave analysis, all the way from raw materials to burning the fuel. Not all feedstocks work for each different conversion technologies. Within the feedstocks we examined, we were looking at all of them except for sweet sorghum for the thermochemical conversion route. We don't look at sweet sorghum mainly due to its moisture content, but also due to its high soluble sugar which would be much more easy to extract and change into an alcohol using a biochemical conversion route. And the goal of this part of the study was to determine the greenhouse gas reductions as compared to gasoline for bioethanol and to determine other environmental impacts. We looked at 1 megajoule of fuel, which is a common functional unit, and if you're not familiar with that type, that's about a 0.028 liters of gasoline as compared to 0.042 liters of ethanol. The reasons why we don't compare perhaps a gallon of gasoline to a gallon of ethanol is the fuel types don't have the same amount of energy locked up within the material. So we have to compare them on a per energy basis, so it'll actually yield different volumes. And again, we're going to do this on a cradle-to-grave basis. And this is just a pictation or visual of a cradle-to-grave boundary. It's feedstock production, creating the trees or the materials in the forest or field, converting that using machines and conversion process, and then also combusting it into your vehicle. And sometimes people refer to this as a well-to-wheel study as well. And I just want to remind you of the carbon flow and how carbon for a biofuels system, it kind of, to a certain degree, is recirculated through due to biomass growth and photosynthesis, whereas with fossil fuel on the right side here, it takes carbon that's been locked up in the ground for thousands, millions of years, and is refined into a fuel which we would burn in our car that is releases CO2 in the environment. There's no recirculation loop there. So for our process simulation that we developed in Aspen, or we used in Aspen, it was about 700,000 bone dry metric tons per year is how much feedstock we took in. The alcohol production would vary depending upon the yield. It's actually produced by, the simulation is produced by NREL, and Phillips et al. Is the reference for that. It's a 2007 report. And of the feedstocks we examined, the two in the red circle there, red box, would qualify as are qualified cellulosic ethanol biomass types, forest residues, and switchgrass. The other ones are interesting and perhaps would warrant some additional look into perhaps being qualified. To give you a little background on process simulation if you aren't so familiar, when there's no facility that you can go measure and you want to do a study surrounding this process that maybe you would like to do or could potentially do, you have to make some assumptions and understand how much energy it takes to create this fuel and how much chemicals and other materials, and understand the different flows. So different software such as Aspen and WindGEMS utilizes thermodynamic relationships, reaction kinetics, and experimental data, and would simulate a facility. And that would give you yields, alcohol production, and emissions. And we use that when there's not an actual facility that we can go measure. And that's pretty important for economics and technical analysis as well as life cycle assessment. Just a quick glimpse of an Aspen model. It's pretty complicated. It took me quite a while to get up to speed on this. I don't expect you to really understand it. I'm going to give you a slightly simplified version, but this is kind of what the program looks like. And here is the biomass gasification to mix alcohol process flow diagram. And I'll run you through just a little bit of how this process actually converts wood into alcohols. First, you have green wood coming on the left, and that is heated with flue gas from later in the system, and it's heated and removes the moisture down to about 5% before it is gasified. Gasification is heating the wood to maybe over 1,000 degrees, and it would normally burn if you were to do that in an open atmosphere. However, it's deprived of oxygen, so it cannot burn. And it creates these two substances called syngas. Syngas is primarily CO and H2, as well as is often contaminated with tars and other acid gases that must be cleaned out before it is sent to alcohol synthesis to avoid catalyst fouling. In alcohol synthesis, you would create alcohols, a variety of them, and you must separate them to ethanol and propanol, and there's some other ones, but the primary two are ethanol and propanol. And each one of those processes requires steam and power and different utilities to accomplish each different unit process. One important input parameter for this would be the biomass composition. We used ultimate and approximate analysis. On the left-hand side, from carbon to ash, that's ultimate analysis. On the right side is approximate. So for biomass gasification, the carbon content is very important, and that drives a lot of the yields. So having high ash, for instance, in the corn stover and switchgrass, around 5 to 11 for corn stover, that's going to reduce the yield because the carbon is what is ultimately going to be converted to alcohol. When examining these different scenarios on a cradle-to-grave basis, we compared them to gasoline, and we reported the greenhouse gas reductions as compared to gasoline, and also the kilograms of CO2 per megajoule. So the little diamonds there indicate the percent reduction. And as you can see that the forest-based materials, they're all around 70s, and switchgrass is a tiny bit lower, around 65. That's primarily due to lower carbon content initially in the production of biomass, as well as just it requires more energy to produce the biomass as you harvest yearly, and it also requires more fertilizers and herbicides. And as you can see, the feedstock production, that really drives a lot of it. That's the big negative there, and that influences most more than anything. So land use change, as I mentioned earlier, is really important. So when examining land use change in conjunction with the net greenhouse gases, we have this figure here. We have on the left-hand axis kilograms of CO2 equivalents per megajoule of fuel. And the bars are the values without land use change, and then the diamonds and the different dots there, they represent with land use change. So for instance, on the left-hand side, pine, if we have the blue diamond, which you can barely see in the bottom, that is converting cropland to pine, it would have almost a negative emission. It would actually take up carbon. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, switchgrass, if you take coniferous national forests and convert to switchgrass, the emissions would be significantly higher, and that would actually be reduce the greenhouse gas reductions to below 60%, maybe like 40%, and it may not qualify for renewable fuel cellulosic ethanol at that point. One thing you may notice as well is unmanaged hardwood. The data spread is very different for that particular scenario, and that's resulting from the biomass productivity. About 1 ton per acre per year is what you'd expect from unmanaged hardwood. So in order to supply a facility with 500,000 or 700,000 bone dry tons per year, it's going to require much more land. So to convert all that land would have a larger impact on land use change. So far we've mainly talked about the greenhouse gas emissions, and they are important. I think that's what is mostly the buzz in today's society and most people understand, but that's not the only environmental impacts there are that these biofuels could produce. There's a lot of other ones, such as acidification, eutrophication, ozone depletion, and smog. There's a list of them, and we use the Tracy Impact Assessment method to examine these environmental impacts. Here we have a figure that compares the environmental impacts for each one of those categories to gasoline or to the scenario with the highest impact. And you can read this as, on the left-hand side for global warming, switchgrass is about 40% of gasoline. Gasoline is higher in several different impact categories, but not all of them. Acidification, it's higher for switchgrass, and smog is actually higher for all the biofuels, and that's partially due to the processing and the VOCs that are driven off during biomass drying. And also eutrophication is another indicator that's higher for both eucalyptus and switchgrass, and that's partially due to fertilizers in the production. So it's a mixed bag here. You have some that are better, some impact categories that you would reduce using biofuels, and some that you would increase. So I mentioned earlier that the environmental impacts and global warming was potentially some driving forces for biofuels, but also energy security. To understand how these fuels may impact energy security, we examine all the energy it took to produce the biomass, transport it, the chemicals needed to convert the biomass into fuel, and transport that fuel. We accounted for all that, and we determined that the production of cellulosic ethanol from pine would reduce the fossil usage by about 97%. For switchgrass, it's about 81%, and that's due to higher diesel usages and chemical usages early on in the feedstock production system. And this right here would represent 1 unit of gasoline being leveraged into many units of biofuel, which is ideally what we want. So to kind of wrap it up, we're going to break it into 3 sections. First, discuss the feedstock production, and then the cradle-to-grave aspects of biofuels, and then just to touch on the LCA. So starting with feedstock production, the harvest and storage impacts are significant. I think we're having technical difficulty. Okay, we're back. The harvest and storage impacts were significant for the agricultural materials, and the forest-based materials did not have that. Typically, agriculture feedstocks have a higher impact for both greenhouse gases as well as other impact categories due to more intensive land management and fertilizer use, and as well converting to some of these agriculture feedstocks that could have serious land use change implications. Perhaps that's up to about 20% of your overall impact. And delivered costs for agriculture feedstocks were typically a little bit higher than forest-based materials. Another thing that was interesting that is somewhat contrary to some people's belief is transportation represents a minimal greenhouse gas impact as compared to the overall. Examining biofuels on a cradle-to-grave basis, each one of these scenarios reduced greenhouse gases as compared to gasoline, although some other impacts did increase with the use of these biofuels. Feedstock composition matters, so the type of feedstock would dictate how well it's converted to biofuels and how much chemicals it would take. And also land use change can significantly influence the overall greenhouse gas reductions. And in the case of switchgrass, would remove it from above 60% reductions and potentially disqualify as a renewable fuel, cellulosic ethanol. Just kind of to bring back to which impacts were more affected by biofuels and gasoline. The decrease on the left, the increase on the right, global warming, acidification except for switchgrass, carcinogens and non-carcinogens and ecotoxicity were all mostly lowered by biofuels. However, respiratory effects, eutrophication, ozone, and smog were all increased in at least one or two situations for the biofuels. So we have to make a decision here. The LCA won't tell us which one we should, as a society, should support. It really comes into what we care about, where we are. In California, smog is a big issue, but some places it is not, whereas the respiratory effects, particulate, if you facility or people are burning the fuels in a rural area where there's not many people, that's not such a problem. But if it's around a lot of people, it is. So we have to really make a judgment call and use life cycle assessment to inform us, but ultimately it's the policymakers and decision makers to understand which one would be more beneficial for us to pursue. Kind of a little bit more on that, LCA can be a useful tool for policymakers. It doesn't always drive the decision. Financial analysis typically does, but it's much better to deal with it both together because a financial analysis requires a lot of the same data that an LCA actually does. So giving both sides of the story is much more robust. And LCA cannot give you an exact answer. It can't be give you an exact number of what the impact is. Typically it's a range. And it's even sometimes more powerful when used in a comparison of a scenario A versus scenario B using the same assumptions. So understanding what LCA is and isn't is pretty important. And I think it should be typically, when done together with LCA and financial analysis, it creates some synergy to give us the most informed decisions. That more or less wraps it up. So I'd like to thank the IBSS project for support and the USDA, as well as the Quorum and the Biofuel Center for North Carolina. And for any more information after the question session here, please don't hesitate to contact me if you'd like to know more about this. So at this point, I'll hand over to Helene and perhaps open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Jesse. Great presentation, great overall scope of everything that goes into LCA. I did place in the chat window if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them for Jesse. Well, it looks like you did a great job explaining everything, Jesse. So far, I don't have any questions right now. I guess if we come up with some as we're going through these, the next slides for the continuing education credits.
Yeah, there'll be a few there.
Yeah, we could always send them to you. So I'll turn it over to Bob to go over all the continuing education part. But I'd also like to thank the audience for joining this session today. We will have more. Oh, there's a question. Not free to go yet, Jesse. Okay.
Okay.
So in Northeast, there has been talk about using hybrid poplar. Any guesses how that would end up in this study?
Yeah, hybrid poplar, I believe it's, I've done a little bit of reading about that. It's a lot of times grown in short rotation, and it's more of a hardwood, so it has a nice carbon content, and be probably somewhat similar to eucalyptus. And depending on the, I guess the conversion technology, the thermochemical, would be pretty similar to the other wood-based materials. If you start running it through a biochemical conversion, it might actually do better than pine that has a lot of lignin. The hardwood of poplar is a little bit better for biochemical conversion. So it would probably be similar to what we showed you here.
Well, thank you. And see if anyone else types anything else up. Looks like you answered his question, Jesse. But yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone that we still are doing series. There's going to be a couple of webinars up and coming based on advanced biofuels and trying to do the education outreach component. There's a lot that goes in with advanced biofuels, and I'm trying to cover a whole series of topics. With this being tools to use, tools that the EPA is using to determine which feedstocks are available, what that meet greenhouse gas reductions. We'll also take a look at creating and maintaining a workforce for biofuels in the future, and also transportation, logistics, and feedstocks demands for commercial facility. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bob and conclude. Wait, we got another question. Jesse, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
what was the, are you looking at it now?
Yes, I can tell
Okay.
you. So it says, what was the number comparing switchgrass and sorghum about carbon dioxide reduction? I think I can show this figure right here, and I hope I can answer that question. So, well, I guess sweet sorghum we did not examine through the thermochemical conversion, but here's switchgrass greenhouse gas reduction for the whole biofuels life cycle. But we can go back to here, and I'm not sure what the actual value is between the switchgrass and sweet sorghum, but the sweet sorghum takes up less carbon during biomass growth. And here you can see as well the CO2 uptake is going to be on the right-hand axis here a bit less for sweet sorghum, though maybe not significantly different than switchgrass. So you may say they're relatively similar.
Is it more yield per acre, Jesse, that's driving that for sweet sorghum?
That drives that? Part of it's going to be the biomass decomposition when stored. For sweet sorghum is higher, and that's due to higher moisture content and just the nature of the material and its composition. It degrades by about 14%, while switchgrass does about 7% of the mass actually would disappear in the CO2. So that's going to be one significant difference, as well as just the nature of how you plant it and the different materials and harvesting techniques that are used early on. That's going to drive that as well.
So would it be safe to say, I had a question here, does sorghum do better for sequestration?
Actually, it does not. So what is more desirable here is a negative emission. So that's how much carbon is taken in. So forest residues here more or less takes the most. So it's going to, how much carbon is taken out of the atmosphere is locked up in biomass, which then can be used for something else. So sweet sorghum actually takes less in from the environment per ton.
I had another question, Jesse. Could you maybe share on what kinds of entities use this information? I did mention EPA, but are there other entities that are using LCA for decision making?
Certainly. Just to relate to the IBSS project, I believe that most government-funded research is required to perform this type of study now, and that's one reason why the IBSS project has it. And it's really important for the biofuels industry. They're required to do this, which is in order to get the RIN creditations. Some municipalities may do it. It's maybe not their most priority, but other private companies have gone into performing life cycle assessments a lot of times to keep to help their market, to keep market share where other products have come out, and also to stimulate growth. And there's also quite a demand from the consumers these days that they may not pay more for the actual green product, but if there's one next to each other, they may prefer the more green product choice.
Jesse, I'm trying to find your slide with the percent carbon to percentage fixed carbon and ash.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. Oh, here we go.
I believe someone has a question on it, or they just want to take a look at it here. Maybe
There you go. And there's a wide list of available of ultimate and approximate analyses. If you'd like to learn more, I can send you a source. And unfortunately, if you're wondering about sweet sorghum, it's not listed on here, but I think it is around 48–49% carbon.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm probably going to say his name wrong. Mr. Masson had a question about it. He does. Can you please differentiate between the percentage carbon and percentage fixed carbon?
Yeah, no problem. When examining the ultimate and approximate analysis for these different biomass types, I believe they use a system where they would burn the material off, and the amount of carbon that is released as a gas is typically called volatile matter, volatile carbon. So it's going to be what comes off, I guess, and then fixed carbon is what's left behind, such as like char. So it indicates how readily the carbon is removed, I suppose. So it's a little bit different. So fixed carbon it's kind of how the tendency to create a char, and then overall carbon, the ultimate on the left, is just how much carbon is in that material.
Jesse, I was curious, for the NREL lab where they're doing the gasification process, what kind of feedstocks are they using again?
The original study, I believe, examined hybrid poplar. So they modeled that. They did not do a full Cradle-to-Grave LCA. They just did a techno-economic analysis. And we expanded that model to do additional feedstocks, which took some effort. But they originally modeled hybrid poplar.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great questions.
Looks like we're going to wrap up the questions here, Jesse. I did provide your email there in the chat window. So if anyone wants to personally email you with their own questions about your presentation, they can.
Great.
And it looks like Bob's getting ready to type something here.
Okay, well, thank everybody so much for the attention, and I look forward to any other questions you may have.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Helene. Folks, it's time for us to wrap up today's webinar. I do like to take this opportunity again to say thanks to Jesse for his work in this area and for taking the time to present to our audience today, and Helene for putting this all together and everything. As indicated here, to qualify for continuing education credits, if you join the session for these credits, you'll need to complete a satisfaction survey and a short quiz at the end of today's webinar. And I've already provided that link inside the chat window, but I'm also going to push that out, which will launch everybody's browsers. Be patient. There is over 40 of us that will, our browsers will launch all at once. So So what should have happened or is happening, your browser window should be launching on your computer. It may pop up behind Blackboard Collaborate, or it may pop up in front of it. If for some reason it doesn't work, you can always click on the live link that's inside the chat window here, and that will also launch the evaluation and the quiz if you need that for continuing education credits. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar.